You don't get to fake the law in front of my front door and expect me to blink. The first thing I heard that morning was a fist pounding against the wood like it owned the place. Not a polite knock, not a neighbor with a package, not the soft tap of somebody who knew what 6:12 in the morning felt like in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. This was hard, sharp, impatient, the kind of sound that cuts straight through sleep and lands in your chest before your feet even hit the floor. I remember the blue glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen, the smell of yesterday's coffee still faint in the air, the chill of the hardwood under my feet, and the way the whole house felt too still for the noise waiting on the other side of that door. Then came the voice. Open up. HOA enforcement. Not police. Not sheriff. Not anything real. Just close enough to sound official if you were scared and far enough from the truth to make my stomach turn cold. I pulled the curtain at the edge of the window and saw two men on my porch in cheap black tactical vests that looked like they came from an online clearance sale, standing too wide, too stiff, trying way too hard to look like authority. One had a radio clipped to his chest that wasn't even turned on. The other had a shiny badge hanging from his vest, plastic catching the sunrise like a toy left on a dashboard. And there, at the bottom of my walkway, wearing a cream blazer at 6 in the morning like she was arriving at a ribbon cutting instead of a stunt, stood Rebecca Holloway, president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, hands folded, chin lifted, smiling like she had been rehearsing this moment in the mirror. The sprinklers ticked across the lawn next door. A dog barked somewhere behind the row of hedges. I could feel eyes on me before I even opened the door, that invisible suburban audience watching from behind blinds. Coffee mugs paused halfway to their mouths. I opened it anyway. Cool air rushed in. The taller guy stepped forward and held up a laminated card so fast, it almost looked deliberate. Ethan Walker, he said, trying on my name like it belonged to him. You are being detained for repeated violations of community safety compliance. That sentence alone told me everything. Real authority doesn't talk like that. Real authority doesn't sound like a committee email wearing boots. But he kept going, and the more he talked, the worse it got. Failure to cooperate with HOA directives. Refusal to submit vehicle documentation. Suspicious conduct. You need to come with us. Come with us. Like this was a traffic stop. Like Rebecca had finally found a way to turn her clipboard into a badge. I looked past him and saw her expression sharpen, the corners of her mouth lifting just a little higher when she realized I wasn't arguing yet. That was her favorite moment with people, the second right before fear usually took over. Rebecca lived for that second. I'd only been in that neighborhood 10 days, and somehow that had been enough for her to build an entire fantasy around me. To her, I wasn't a homeowner who paid on time and kept to himself. I was a problem because I didn't explain myself, didn't join the little circles by the mailbox, didn't laugh at her jokes in the clubhouse, didn't hand over pieces of my life just because she asked with that polished country club smile. And Rebecca had a gift for turning curiosity into accusation faster than anybody I'd ever met. The shorter guy shifted his weight and reached toward my wrist, not rough, not dramatic, just confident in the way men get when they think a costume is doing the heavy lifting for them. The ceramic mug in my hand was still warm. I set it down slowly on the table just inside the doorway and let the silence stretch. From across the street, a garage door hummed open an inch, then stopped. Somebody was filming. Probably 3 somebodies. Rebecca took one step closer on the driveway and said it in that bright, rehearsed voice she used at HOA meetings when she wanted a room to think she was being reasonable. Mr. Walker, this is what happens when you refuse to follow the rules. Around here, I am the law. That line hung in the cool morning air for half a second, neat and smug and polished. And I swear even the birds went quiet. I looked at the fake badge, then at the dead radio, then at Rebecca standing there in her perfect heels on a concrete driveway she thought was a throne. And in that exact moment, with the sun just cresting over the rooftops and my neighbors watching from behind their curtains, I realized this wasn't about parking or notices or community compliance anymore. Rebecca Holloway had decided to put on a costume and stage a little arrest on my porch. What she didn't know was that I had spent most of my adult life taking down people who confused performance with power. 10 days earlier, Maple Ridge Estates had looked exactly like the kind of place people move to when they are tired of noise, tired of sirens, tired of apartment walls so thin you can hear somebody else living through them. The streets curved in clean little loops. The sidewalks were edged with fresh mulch, and every mailbox had the same black iron post like the whole neighborhood had been stamped out of a catalog and set gently under a bright Carolina sky. My house sat near the end of a cul-de-sac with a two-car garage, a narrow front porch, and a maple tree out back that dropped red leaves over the fence every evening like clockwork. I had picked it because it was boring in the best possible way. Quiet. Predictable. Ordinary. Those are rare luxuries when your work teaches you that the loudest person in the room usually wants something, and the most dangerous lies are almost always wrapped in normal packaging. I moved in on a Thursday just after lunch. The air smelled like cardboard, fresh paint, and hot asphalt, and by the time the movers pulled away, I had sweat through my t-shirt and gone through half a case of bottled water. I remember standing in the driveway with my keys in one hand and looking at the place like it was not much to anyone else, but maybe it could be enough for me. Enough space. Enough silence. Enough distance from the parts of my life I never brought home. The first person who introduced herself was not a neighbor with cookies or a guy offering to lend me a ladder. It was Rebecca Holloway. She came walking up my driveway before I had even finished breaking down the last moving box, wearing white capris, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of smile people practice for charity luncheons and disciplinary meetings. She carried a leather folder under one arm and a stainless steel tumbler in the other like she was permanently in transit between control and caffeine. "Welcome to Maple Ridge," she said, drawing out the last word as if she personally owned the trademark. "I am Rebecca Holloway, your HOA president." There was a beat after that, the kind of beat meant for recognition, maybe gratitude, maybe mild intimidation. I just wiped my hands on my jeans and told her it was nice to meet her. Her eyes slid past me into the garage, taking inventory before I had invited her to do it. She asked where I had moved from. I gave her the state, not the city. She asked if I was married. I said no. She asked what line of work I was in. I told her I worked long hours and liked my privacy. Most people hear that and move on. Rebecca heard it like a challenge. I could see the adjustment happen behind her smile, the small recalculation that turned me from new resident into unanswered question. She handed me a welcome packet thick enough to stop a door and tapped the cover with one manicured finger. "We are very serious about standards here," she said. "People love this neighborhood because we protect property values." It was the kind of sentence that sounds harmless until you hear the emphasis. Protect. Values. Here. I thanked her, and she lingered anyway, asking whether the dark SUV in my garage was personal or company issued, whether I planned to install any security cameras visible from the street, whether the porch light I had ordered online matched approved exterior finishes. She did not ask those questions like a person making conversation. She asked them like a woman testing the shape of a lock. I noticed then that every house on the block had the same trimmed hedges, the same approved flower beds, the same front doors in a narrow band of respectable colors, and for the first time the place felt a little less like peace and a little more like choreography. Over the next few days, I learned the rhythm of Maple Ridge. Lawns got cut on Fridays. Garbage cans disappeared by noon on Tuesdays. People waved with two fingers from behind the wheel, but rarely stopped long enough to say anything honest. And Rebecca was everywhere. On her morning walk with that metal tumbler. At the cluster mailbox. By the pool gate checking wristbands like a cruise ship manager with a personal grudge. She moved through the neighborhood like she was collecting details, always smiling, always noticing. By Sunday, she had already sent me my first email. Friendly subject line. Sharp little message. My moving boxes had stayed visible in the garage too long with the door open. My trash bin had been angled incorrectly by the curb. My vehicle had been observed in the driveway after 10 o'clock and would need to comply with community parking review if it continued. Parking review. The phrase made me laugh the first time I read it. Just one quiet breath through my nose while I stood in my kitchen with a paper plate and cold takeout. But the thing about people like Rebecca is that they count on normal people laughing first. They count on you assuming they will eventually rediscover proportion. What I did not understand yet was that she had spent years building a little private kingdom out of email templates, meeting minutes, and frightened compliance. And because I had given her nothing personal, nothing social, nothing she could sort into one of her neat little boxes, she had already started circling me like I was the first interesting thing that had happened on her street in years. By the middle of that first week, I understood something important about Rebecca Holloway. She did not think of herself as a difficult neighbor. Difficult people know they are creating friction. Rebecca thought she was a system. She moved through Maple Ridge like a set of bylaws had learned to wear perfume and drive a luxury sport utility vehicle. Every conversation with her had the same shape. It started pleasant, narrowed fast, and ended with a reminder that she was watching. On Monday morning, she caught me bringing in groceries and mentioned that my porch light looked a little brighter than the approved exterior standard. Tuesday afternoon, she stopped at the edge of my lawn to tell me the decorative flag holder by my front steps could become a compliance issue if I ever put up anything seasonal without prior review. Wednesday, she somehow appeared the exact moment a delivery driver left a stack of flat-packed shelves in my garage and asked, with a little laugh, whether I planned to store business materials on site. It was never enough to sound openly hostile. That was what made her good at it. Every line came wrapped in concern, courtesy, or policy language so polished it reflected blame away from her and back onto whoever was unlucky enough to be standing there. I answered with the same measured tone every time. Yes, ma'am. I will review the guidelines. Thank you for letting me know. People like Rebecca mistake restraint for weakness because they have never had to learn the difference between self-control and surrender. By Thursday, the emails started arriving twice a day. One about the angle of my trash bin after pickup. One about the temporary placement of moving blankets visible through the garage window. One about the camera over my front door, which she described as a possible privacy concern for the community, even though half the houses on the block had the same model pointed at the same sidewalk. Then came the one that told me exactly where this was going. Subject line, vehicle documentation request. It hit my inbox at 8:17 p.m. while I was standing at my kitchen counter eating reheated lasagna out of a ceramic bowl. Rebecca wrote that my dark gray sport utility vehicle had been observed returning after 10 o'clock on multiple evenings and therefore required verification under community safety guidelines. Verification of what? She did not say. Registration, employer, purpose, frequency, anything she could get. She asked that I submit documentation within 48 hours to avoid further action. I read it twice, set the bowl down, and looked out through the window above the sink. Across the street, her driveway lights were on, bright and theatrical, washing her perfect front columns in warm gold. It struck me then that she had probably timed the email to land when most people were tired enough to comply without thinking. Tired people explain themselves. Tired people upload documents. Tired people hand power to whoever sounds official enough. I did not respond that night. The next afternoon, I came home a little before 6 with the sky still pale and hot, and found Rebecca standing near my driveway with a man I had not seen before, both of them looking at my vehicle like it had parked there to insult them personally. The man wore khakis, wraparound sunglasses, and one of those tucked-in polo shirts that screams unpaid authority. Rebecca smiled when she saw me and tapped the side of her leather folder. Mr. Walker, this is Trent Malloy. He helps advise us on neighborhood security matters. Trent gave me the kind of handshake that tries too hard to feel official. Rebecca asked, in front of him, whether I had brought the requested documentation. I told her I had reviewed the governing documents she gave me and did not see any provision requiring residents to disclose private employment information based on the time they came home. Her smile did not disappear, but it did tighten. That is a very technical answer, she said. We are just trying to keep everyone safe. That word again. Safe. People who want access to your life love to call it safety. I asked what exactly made my parked vehicle unsafe. Trent cleared his throat and stepped in like an understudy desperate for a speaking role. He said there had been concerns. Community concerns. Unspecified concerns. The sort of vague little cloud bureaucrats manufacture when facts would only get in the way. I looked from him to Rebecca and realized this was no longer casual curiosity. She had recruited an audience for her suspicion. She wanted witnesses. She wanted her questions to feel bigger just because a second person was standing there nodding. My vehicle is legally registered, insured, and parked in my own driveway, I said. If there is a written rule you think I am violating, email it to me and I will respond in writing. Trent actually seemed taken aback by that, like he had expected apology or panic. Rebecca did not. Rebecca had expected resistance the moment I refused to become easy. The late sun flashed off her bracelet as she crossed her arms and tilted her head. People who have nothing to hide usually do not act this guarded, she said. There it was. Not policy. Not concern. Accusation. Finally honest enough to show its face. The breeze carried the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block. A boy on a bicycle rolled past slowly, then slower when he sensed tension. I could feel the neighborhood listening. I told Rebecca that privacy was not suspicious and that any future communication should be sent by email. Then I walked inside, calm on the outside, fully aware that I had just watched her move from fishing to fixation. And when I checked my inbox an hour later and saw a formal notice of non-cooperation waiting for me, complete with red lettering and a reference to escalating community enforcement options, I knew she was not improvising anymore. Rebecca Holloway had decided that if she could not make me explain myself, she would make the entire neighborhood believe I needed to. The next morning, I started paying attention the way I do when a person stops being annoying and starts becoming deliberate. There is a difference, and it usually shows up in timing first. Rebecca stopped approaching me at random and started appearing when other people were around. At the mailbox, just as two retirees were sorting catalogs into neat piles. Near the pool gate when a young mother was buckling her daughter into a stroller. Outside the clubhouse before the monthly board meeting when half the neighborhood was already drifting toward the entrance with casserole dishes and folding chairs. She was not trying to get information from me anymore. She was creating a pattern other people could watch. That Friday afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange notice tucked into my front door frame, the paper stiff and cheap, flapping in the warm wind like a warning tag on misplaced luggage. It cited non-cooperation, vehicle review non-compliance, and failure to respond in a manner consistent with community expectations. Community expectations. That phrase stuck with me because it was so perfectly slippery. No specific rule. No measurable violation. Just a mood dressed up like governance. I stepped back into the driveway and looked around. Fresh-cut grass. The low hum of an air conditioner 2 houses down. A teenager bouncing a basketball in a nearby cul-de-sac. It all looked normal enough to fool anybody who had never seen how control works when it is trying not to look like control. 10 minutes later, Rebecca appeared at the edge of my lawn carrying that leather folder like it had grown there. She asked if I had received the notice. I told her I had. She asked whether I intended to cooperate. I asked which covenant specifically required me to disclose private information about my employment or vehicle usage. Her eyes went flat for half a second, like a theater light cutting out behind a painted set. Then she smiled again and said, "Mr. Walker, attitude always makes these situations harder than they need to be." I remember the smell of pine straw baking in the afternoon heat and the way one of my moving boxes was still visible through the garage window. Rebecca glanced at it, as if even cardboard could testify against me. "People are starting to ask questions," she said softly. That one was not for me. That line was for the imaginary jury. She was building one suggestion at a time. I told her people were free to ask anything they liked, and I was free not to answer personal questions from the homeowners association. She gave a little laugh, almost sympathetic, and said, "That kind of secrecy tends to make neighbors nervous." Then she walked away before I could answer, leaving the statement hanging in the air like perfume. By Saturday morning, Maple Ridge had started to feel different. The glances lasted a little longer. A man washing his pickup across the street stopped mid-sponge when my vehicle rolled into the driveway. A woman walking her golden retriever smiled at me, but it was the careful smile people use when they are not sure whether they are greeting a neighbor or measuring a rumor. Rebecca had done exactly what people like her always do. She had taken a blank space and filled it with suspicion because suspicion is easier to manage than facts. That afternoon I sat at my kitchen table with the governing documents spread out in front of me, page after page of bylaws, amendments, parking restrictions, architectural standards, pool rules, holiday decor deadlines, and enforcement procedures. I read every line twice. There were sections on overnight street parking, commercial signage, fence heights, satellite dish placement, and nuisance conduct. There was nothing, not one sentence, giving the board authority to demand private employment records or question a lawfully parked vehicle in a private driveway because the owner came home late. Rebecca knew that, which meant this was no longer about interpreting rules. It was about seeing how far rules could be stretched when the target had not yet pushed back in public. Sunday evening brought the next test. I was bringing in a small grocery order, 2 paper bags cutting into my fingers, when Trent Malloy pulled up beside the curb in a white crossover with magnetic door decals that read community patrol services in dark blue letters that were clearly meant to look more official than they were. He rolled down the window and asked, with rehearsed casualness, whether I had resolved my standing issues with the association. Standing issues. Another phrase built to sound bigger than reality. I asked whether he worked for the board. He said he was a consultant. I asked whether he was licensed law enforcement. He said that was not relevant. That answer told me everything I needed to know about him. Men who have real authority never dodge the plain version of that question. Trent leaned an elbow on the window frame and lowered his voice like we were sharing some private advice. He said Rebecca was trying to keep the situation from escalating and suggested that a cooperative resident would simply provide whatever was requested. I set the grocery bags on the hood of my car and looked at the decal on his door, slightly crooked at the edges, bubbling where the adhesive had not settled flat. Even his branding was pretending. I told him I would communicate with the association in writing and only in writing. He smiled the way people smile when they think they are being patient with somebody unreasonable. That is probably wise, he said, because the board does not like unpredictability. He drove off slowly enough to be seen. That part mattered. Everything with Rebecca mattered because it was all performance. And when I checked my email that night and found a formal notice summoning me to address a safety concern at the upcoming HOA meeting, with my property listed on the agenda in bold letters, I realized she was done probing in private. Rebecca Holloway had decided the next step was public theater, and she expected me to walk into it unprepared. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee, lemon cleaner, and the kind of old carpet that holds every bad meeting it has ever heard. By the time I walked in that Tuesday night, the folding chairs were already half full, the overhead lights buzzing softly against the beige ceiling, and Rebecca Holloway was standing near the front table in a navy dress with a silver pen in her hand, like she was preparing to sign a treaty instead of stage a character assassination. A tray of store-bought cookies sat untouched beside a stack of printed agendas, and my address was there in black ink halfway down the page under the words Community Safety Review. Not Covenant Enforcement. Not Parking Clarification. Community Safety. She had widened the language on purpose. People will ignore a rules dispute. People lean forward for danger. I took a seat in the second row, close enough to hear everything clearly and far enough back to watch the room. Trent Malloy was posted along the side wall in another tucked-in polo, arms folded, trying to look detached, while making sure everyone noticed he was there. Two board members shuffled papers and avoided eye contact with me. The residents around me did what people do when they want gossip without accountability. They smiled too quickly, then turned away. A woman in a green cardigan kept glancing at me over the rim of her water bottle. An older man near the coffee urn whispered something to his wife, and both of them looked down the second I met their eyes. Rebecca called the meeting to order with the flat tap of a pen against a clipboard. Routine items came first. Landscaping bids, pool maintenance, holiday decoration deadlines. She moved through them briskly, but I could feel her saving energy for my part, sharpening herself in public one harmless agenda item at a time. When she finally said my address, the room changed. You can hear attention when a neighborhood shifts into listening mode. It is not loud. It is the sound of paper stopping, chairs settling, throats going quiet. Rebecca clasped her hands and gave the room a sorrowful expression so practiced it might as well have been laminated. She said the board had received concerns regarding repeated noncompliance, refusal to cooperate with safety-related inquiries, and behavior inconsistent with the transparency expected in a close-knit community. Transparency. Another polished word built to make privacy sound antisocial. She never once said what actual rule I had broken because she could not. Instead, she built a fog and invited everyone to get nervous inside it. Then she looked directly at me and asked whether I would like the opportunity to explain my late-night vehicle activity, my refusal to submit requested documentation, and my general unwillingness to engage constructively with neighborhood leadership. There it was. Not a policy question. A loyalty test. I could feel 20 pairs of eyes settle on the back of my neck. The air conditioner kicked on with a low metallic groan. Somewhere behind me, somebody opened a plastic bottle and then stopped. Halfway through the twist of the cap, like they did not want to miss a word. I stood up slowly and held the printed agenda in one hand. I am happy to respond to any specific covenant you believe I have violated, I said. I reviewed the governing documents. I did not find any provision requiring a homeowner to disclose private employment information or explain when he comes home to a lawfully parked vehicle in his own driveway. The room stayed quiet, but it was a different quiet now. People had expected either panic or anger. Calm always sounds louder than it should when somebody is trying to paint you as unstable. Rebecca tilted her head and gave a little smile that did not reach her eyes. "This is exactly the kind of technical deflection that concerns residents," she said. "No one is attacking you, Mr. Walker. We are asking for basic cooperation." I noticed then that she had not said homeowners. She had said residents. She wanted renters, spouses, visiting relatives, everybody in that room to feel included in the suspicion. She wanted my silence to feel personal to them. One of the board members, a man named Alan with a red face and nervous hands, cleared his throat and asked whether there had been any direct reports of misconduct. Rebecca answered for him before he finished the question. She said the issue was not a single act. It was a pattern. Evasiveness, secrecy, unpredictability. Each word landed softer than an accusation and harder than a fact. Trent gave a solemn little nod from the wall, and I almost admired the commitment to the performance. Almost. I asked Rebecca whether she would read aloud the exact section of the bylaws authorizing the board to demand the documents she had requested. She did not. Instead, she shuffled the papers in front of her, glanced at the room, and said some situations require discretion. That was the moment I knew she did not just suspect I had something to hide. She needed the neighborhood to believe it. Because once a crowd starts helping tell your story, facts become much harder to reintroduce. A woman near the back raised her hand and asked, carefully, whether law enforcement had been contacted. Rebecca paused for half a second too long, then said the board was consulting with security professionals as needed. Consulting. Professionals. More. Smoke. Not one real answer in sight. I sat back down without another word, and that irritated her more than any argument could have. She wanted a scene. She wanted emotion she could label dangerous. Instead, all she got was a man in a folding chair letting her overreach in full view of her own audience. When the meeting ended, conversations started in low clusters around the coffee station and the exit doors. Nobody confronted me. Nobody apologized either. They just watched me differently, exactly the way Rebecca wanted. Curious, careful, slightly afraid. As I stepped out into the warm night and heard the cicadas buzzing in the dark pines beyond the parking lot, I understood what she had built in that room. Not a case, not even a complaint, a mood. And moods are useful to people like Rebecca because once fear gets into a neighborhood, they can sell themselves as the only person qualified to manage it. Rebecca escalated the next morning before the dew had even burned off the grass. I opened my front door to find a laminated notice zip-tied to the handle like a tag on impounded property. The plastic edges were already curling in the humidity, and the paper inside was stamped in red with the words restricted amenity access pending safety review. She had suspended my use of the pool, the gym, the clubhouse, and the guest gate code as if I were some kind of community hazard instead of a homeowner with a mailbox key and a mortgage. The absurdity of it almost would have been funny if the whole thing had not been so carefully designed. None of those restrictions could really inconvenience me in any serious way. I had never used the pool. I had walked past the gym once. The clubhouse was a beige box full of folding chairs and bad coffee. That was not the point. The point was theater. Rebecca wanted visible consequences. She wanted my neighbors to see punishment first and ask questions later. By 9 o'clock that morning, the neighborhood app had turned into exactly what she wanted. I did not have to join the discussion to know what it looked like. I could hear it in the silence when I checked my mail and two women near the curb stopped talking mid-sentence. I could see it in the way a man jogging with wireless earbuds looked at my driveway, then at the orange notice still taped beside my door, then kept moving without waving. She had found the oldest trick in suburban politics. If you cannot prove danger, imply process. People trust process even when it is nonsense because paperwork feels safer than rumor, even when the paperwork is just rumor in a tie. Around noon, I got an email from Rebecca with a subject line written in all capital letters. Final opportunity for voluntary compliance. The body of the message was even more revealing than the formatting. She wrote that my continued resistance had forced the board to expand community security measures and that outside enforcement support would now be authorized if needed. Outside enforcement support. The phrase sat on my screen like a cheap prop trying to pass for federal language. She included Trent Malloy in the email chain and copied 2 board members who had looked uncomfortable the night before, which told me she wanted witnesses inside the record. That mattered. People who think they are untouchable always start documenting the wrong things once they get overconfident. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with the blinds half open, sunlight striping across the wood, and reread every message she had sent since move-in. The pattern was getting cleaner. First curiosity, then documentation requests, then public suspicion, now sanctions and invented enforcement language. This was no longer a woman freelancing her ego through neighborhood email. This was an operation, amateur and petty and ridiculous on the surface, but still deliberate. Around 3 that afternoon, I heard the low growl of a tow truck engine at the end of the cul-de-sac. I stepped to the window and saw a white wrecker easing toward my driveway with a magnetic sign on the door that read Preferred Community Recovery Services. There is something about the sight of a tow truck creeping up to your home that instantly changes the air. It is invasive in a way that feels mechanical and personal at the same time, like bureaucracy has learned how to roll on steel. Trent was in the passenger seat. Rebecca was behind them in her white sport utility vehicle, sunglasses on, one hand resting on the wheel like she was arriving to inspect a renovation. I stepped outside before the truck could even line itself up. Heat rose off the concrete in shimmering waves. The driver climbed down with the uncertain expression of a man who had not been told the full story, but had been promised it was routine. Trent announced that the association was initiating vehicle removal pending unresolved safety verification. I asked him for the written authority authorizing a private homeowners association to tow a lawfully registered vehicle from a private driveway without a court order, municipal directive, or covenant violation. He said the board had broad powers in matters affecting community welfare. I asked him to point to the exact language. He did not. Rebecca stepped forward then, smiling for the benefit of the 2 men standing across the street pretending not to watch. "Mr. Walker," she said, "you have created this situation with your refusal to cooperate." I remember the smell of hot engine oil from the tow truck, the click of a sprinkler head starting up nearby, the way Trent kept adjusting his sunglasses every time I asked a direct question. The driver glanced between us and finally admitted he had only been given an address and told the vehicle was in violation. Not abandoned, not illegally parked. In violation. I told him the car was on private property and that towing it under false pretenses would expose everyone involved to liability. That word changed the temperature. Liability is the kind of language that cuts through make-believe authority fast. The driver looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at Trent. Trent looked anywhere but at me. For a second, the whole performance sagged in the middle like wet cardboard. Then Rebecca recovered and said this was exactly why more formal enforcement might be necessary. More formal. That phrase stayed with me long after the tow truck backed out of the cul-de-sac and left without my vehicle. She was not retreating. She was revising. And when I checked my inbox an hour later and found a board notice stating that a special compliance action would take place the following morning with security personnel present, I realized Rebecca Holloway had crossed into something more dangerous than harassment. She had stopped trying to pressure me into obedience and started building a costume around her own authority, piece by piece, until she believed she could put on a badge and make the whole neighborhood call it law. That night, I did not sleep much. Not because I was afraid of what Rebecca might do in the morning, but because once somebody starts stitching together fake authority out of paper, costumes, and nervous volunteers, the details begin to matter more than the threats. Details are where pretenders always fail. Around 11:30, I turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark for a second, and watched the reflection of my own house in the window over the sink. Across the street, Rebecca's porch lamps still glowed amber against her columns, too bright, too deliberate, like she wanted the whole cul-de-sac to feel supervised even after dark. I made another cup of coffee, spread every email and notice across the table, and started reading them the way I read statements from people who want to sound official without knowing how. The wording was wrong in small but telling ways. She used phrases like detainment review, compliance action, enforcement support, safety verification. They sounded important, but not one of them belonged to any real legal framework. It was imitation language, the verbal equivalent of Trent's magnetic door decals peeling at the corners. Then I noticed something even cleaner. The font on the orange restriction notice was different from the font on the meeting agenda, but identical to the all-capitalized email heading she had sent that morning. Same spacing, same heavy-handed red emphasis, same habit of bolding random nouns to create drama. Rebecca was not just directing this mess. She was manufacturing it. A little after sunrise, before the neighborhood had fully stirred, I stepped outside to take the trash can in and found an older woman standing at the edge of her driveway across the street in a pale blue robe, one hand wrapped around a mug, the other holding her phone like she had been waiting to decide whether to walk over. I recognized her from the mailbox cluster, but had never gotten more than a polite wave. She crossed the street carefully, glancing once toward Rebecca's house before speaking. "My name is Donna Keene," she said softly. "I probably should have minded my own business, but I do not think what happened yesterday was right." Her voice had the dry steadiness of somebody who had spent years being underestimated and had gotten tired of it. She told me her grandson had installed a smart doorbell camera after some package thefts last Christmas and that it caught more of the street. Then she realized. Then she handed me her phone. The video was grainy in that washed-out early evening light, but it was enough. I watched Rebecca's white sport utility vehicle pull up near the curb the day before the tow truck arrived. Trent stepped out of his crossover a minute later. Another man came with him, broader in the shoulders, shaved head, black polo, carrying a small plastic case. They stood beside the rear hatch of Rebecca's vehicle where the camera could not hear everything clearly, but it caught enough body language to tell the story. Rebecca opened the hatch. Trent took out 2 black tactical vests sealed in crinkled plastic. The other man lifted a handful of shiny badges on retractable clips, laughed about something, and held one against his chest while Rebecca nodded. Then Trent pantomimed knocking on a door and reading from a sheet of paper while Rebecca corrected him with the sharp little gesture of a woman who thinks rehearsal is leadership. I watched it twice. On the second viewing, my coffee went cold in my hand. Donna looked at me over the rim of her mug and said, "I do not know what exactly they are planning, but it looked wrong." Wrong was an understatement. This was not neighborhood management anymore. This was costume design. I thanked her and asked if she would be willing to preserve the original file. She said yes immediately, which told me something else Rebecca had probably forgotten. When bullies get too theatrical, quiet people start paying attention. By 8 o'clock, I had 3 more pieces of the puzzle. First, the so-called Community Patrol Services page Trent listed in his email signature was barely a skeleton, a generic business listing with no staff bios, no licensing information, and a mailing address tied to a mailbox rental store in a strip mall 20 miles away. Second, the special compliance action notice attached to my latest email contained a seal at the bottom that read Maple Ridge Enforcement Division, even though no such entity existed anywhere in the governing documents. Third, one of Rebecca's attachments had sloppy metadata. She had converted it from a word processing file on her personal laptop less than 30 minutes before sending it, and the original file name had not been scrubbed. It was called Detained Script Final. I stared at those 3 words for a long second while the air conditioner clicked on above me and cold air brushed the back of my neck. Script. Not policy. Not notice. Script. That was when the whole shape of it came into focus. Rebecca was not improvising a threat. She was staging a scene. She intended to put men in fake authority gear on my porch, use language close enough to scare people, and count on the average suburban witness to confuse confidence with legitimacy. She was betting the neighborhood had never seen a real badge up close, never questioned a man in a vest, never stopped to ask where homeowners association power ends and actual law begins. Most people do not know that line, and people like Rebecca live in that ignorance like it is beachfront property. I sat back in my chair, listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant whine of a leaf blower somewhere down the block, and let the facts settle into place one by one. Fake enforcement language. Rehearsed scripts. Costume badges. A made-up division name. Outside men with no meaningful credentials. Whatever happened next was not going to be a misunderstanding. It was going to be a performance with witnesses, and for the first time since I moved into Maple Ridge, I knew exactly what Rebecca Holloway was building and exactly where the first crack in it had appeared. Once I saw the word script in that file name, everything stopped feeling chaotic and started feeling measurable. That is the part most people never understand about fake authority. It looks bigger when you are standing in front of it, but the second you pull it apart into pieces, it gets flimsy fast. I cleared the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and built a timeline from the day I moved in. Welcome packet. First email. Vehicle documentation request. Public meeting. Amenity restrictions. Tow attempt. Special compliance action. Every message Rebecca had sent, every notice taped to my door, every copied board member, every shift in language from concern to control. I saved screenshots, exported emails with headers, and photographed the laminated tags she kept using like props from some low-budget legal drama. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up slow and ordinary. A sprinkler hissed across a lawn. Somebody started a pickup truck 3 houses over. Wind moved through the maple behind my fence with that dry, papery sound leaves make when summer is starting to lose its grip. Inside my kitchen, the light was clean and pale, and everything smelled like coffee and printer paper. I called the county records office first and confirmed what I already suspected. Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association was registered as a private residential association with civil enforcement authority limited to dues, architectural compliance, fines, hearings, and access to common amenities under its governing documents. Not detainment, not seizure, not enforcement division, not security compliance action at a homeowner's front door. A homeowners association can send letters, schedule hearings, place fines if the documents allow it, and in some cases pursue civil remedies through the courts. What it cannot do is invent police powers because a board president likes the sound of her own commands. That line matters more than people think. A real government officer gets authority from law. A homeowners association gets authority from a contract. One is public power with legal limits. The other is private administration with civil boundaries. Rebecca was betting nobody in Maple Ridge knew the difference well enough to challenge her, while 2 men in vests stood on a porch looking serious. I did. And once you know the line, crossing it is not just obnoxious. It becomes evidence. By 10 o'clock, I had another piece. Donna texted me the full resolution video file and gave permission to preserve it. When I enlarged the frame on my laptop, the details got even better. One of the badges in Trent's hand had a generic eagle on it with no agency marking. The black vest still had fold lines from the packaging. Rebecca held a stapled sheet with the same formatting as the detained script final document. I could not hear every word, but I did not need to. Rehearsal plus costume plus fake legal language tells its own story. A little after noon, an email arrived from Trent with a PDF attachment labeled Notice of Compliance Presence. Compliance presence was not a thing. Not legally, not contractually, not anywhere outside the imagination of people trying to sound official without stepping fully into a term they know can be checked. The document included a gold seal at the bottom and a signature block for community enforcement liaison. Liaison to what, exactly, it did not say. Pretenders love nouns that trail off into fog. I printed it anyway and added it to the stack. Then I looked up the board roster and noticed something Rebecca probably assumed no one would question. The 2 members she kept copying, Alan and Denise, had not signed any of the notices. Their names appeared only on mass emails. Everything aggressive came directly from Rebecca or through Trent. That mattered too. Real institutions spread accountability. Personal power concentrates it. Around 1:30, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Trent left a message in a calm, over-rehearsed tone saying tomorrow morning's compliance action would proceed as scheduled and that my cooperation would be appreciated in order to avoid unnecessary escalation. Escalation into what? He did not say, because saying it clearly would force him to admit he had no lawful endpoint. I saved the voicemail. Then I replayed it twice, listening not to the threat, but to the insecurity under it. Men who have actual legal authority tell you what statute, what warrant, what agency, what process. Men borrowing the posture of authority talk in circles and hope the uniform fills in the blanks. By late afternoon, I had a folder thick enough to make the truth simple. Rebecca had created a pattern of targeted harassment. She had used fabricated administrative language to create the appearance of powers the association did not possess. She had coordinated with private individuals to simulate an enforcement presence. She had attempted to tow a vehicle from private property without clear authority. And now she intended to stage a morning confrontation at my home under a false banner of compliance. The facts were no longer scattered. They were aligned. I sat back in my chair and looked through the window at the long strip of sunlight across my driveway. the exact place where she expected to win. For the first time since this started, I felt the calm settle in completely. Rebecca Holloway thought she was building pressure. What she was really building was a case, and she had delivered most of it to me herself. By early evening, the light outside had gone syrupy and gold, the kind of southern sunset that makes every driveway look calm from a distance even when half the people on the street are whispering behind their curtains. I had my evidence lined up in neat stacks across the kitchen table when the doorbell chimed again, soft this time, not the staged pounding of fake urgency, but the hesitant press of somebody who still believed in manners. It was Donna Keene, still in her house shoes, with a man beside her I had seen once or twice checking mail in a veteran's cap. "This is Harold Becker," she said. "He used to work dispatch for the county." Harold gave me a small nod and stepped inside just far enough to keep the screen door from catching the warm breeze. He did not waste time on small talk. He had heard, through the neighborhood grapevine and through Donna's camera footage, that Rebecca planned to send security to my house in the morning, and he wanted me to know something. A few months earlier, she had tried something similar with a divorced father at the far end of the development, only smaller. Not fake officers. Not this much theater. But she had used Trent and another man to stand in a driveway wearing black polos and speaking in vague official language until the homeowner backed down and paid a fine he did not owe. Harold told me the man moved out 3 weeks later. "She tests people," he said, voice low and level. "If fear works, she keeps going." Donna set her phone on the table beside my printed notices, and for a moment the three of us just looked at the pile. It had weight now, not just paper weight, but pattern weight, the kind that turns private doubt into shared recognition. Harold studied the laminated notice with the fake seal and shook his head. "This is the kind of stuff that tricks regular folks," he said. "Most people hear radio chatter, see a vest, see a badge shape, and they stop asking who is actually in charge." He was right. That is how borrowed authority survives. It does not need everyone to believe. It just needs enough people to hesitate. I asked Harold if he would be willing to put in writing what he knew about prior incidents and the way real county process should sound compared to whatever Trent was trying to imitate. He said yes without blinking. Donna said she would also write a statement and preserve every camera file from the week. Then, as if Rebecca's little kingdom had finally overplayed its hand, more pieces started arriving almost on their own. At 7:15, a woman named Marisol from 2 streets over forwarded me screenshots from the neighborhood app. Rebecca had been feeding selective updates into the residents-only forum for days, using phrases like ongoing safety matter, non-compliant resident, and coordinated response. Marisol had screenshotted them before Rebecca deleted the most aggressive posts. 10 minutes later, Alan, the nervous board member from the clubhouse meeting, called me from his personal phone and sounded like a man trying to step out of a fire without admitting he had helped build it. He said he had never voted for any enforcement action involving private security at a homeowner's residence, and that Rebecca had been handling most of the communications under emergency discretion, which, according to the bylaws I had already reviewed, was not a real board power in any form that applied here. He did not want to get publicly involved, not yet. But he quietly confirmed something that mattered more than courage in that moment. Rebecca was freelancing. She was using the board as wallpaper. After that call, I reached out to the only outside person I trusted to read the civil side of this mess fast and clean. Olivia Grant, real estate and civil litigation attorney. Sharp as broken glass when she needed to be, patient when it counted, and one of the few people I knew who could read a homeowners association document without sounding bored or cruel. I sent her the notices, the email chain, the screenshots, the metadata, and the still frame from Donna's camera showing the fake badges in Trent's hand. Olivia called back 20 minutes later. I could hear keyboard clicks in the background and the distant murmur of office air through her headset. "He cannot detain you. She cannot create an enforcement branch. They cannot remove you from your own property under a private covenant process," she said. At this point, Ethan, the important thing is that they keep talking and keep showing up exactly as planned. That line landed with perfect clarity. Keep talking. Keep showing up. Let the costume walk onto the stage. I stood by the kitchen counter after we hung up, listening to the refrigerator hum and the cicadas starting up outside in the trees, and looked at the little coalition forming around my table. Donna with her camera footage. Harold with his dispatcher instincts. Marisol with the screenshots Rebecca forgot other people could save. Alan with his reluctant confirmation. Olivia with the civil map of where the line had already been crossed. Rebecca thought she had isolated me. What she had really done was wake up the one thing bullies never know how to manage once it starts moving: quiet people comparing notes. After everyone left, the house went quiet in that particular way a place does when the night has turned from evening into strategy. The dishwasher hummed low in the kitchen. A moth kept tapping itself against the porch light outside the sidelight window. Somewhere down the block, a garage door rolled shut, and the sound echoed through the cul-de-sac like a stagehand pulling scenery into place. I stood at the counter with Olivia on speakerphone, Donna's camera footage open on my laptop, Harold's handwritten notes beside it, and the fake notices stacked in a neat pile that looked almost respectable until you actually read them. Olivia told me the same thing twice, which was how I knew she wanted it to land. Do not interrupt them too early. Let them identify themselves. Let them use their words. Let them commit to the costume. I looked through the window over the sink and saw Rebecca's porch lights still burning across the street, steady and self-important, and I could almost feel her excitement from there. She thought morning was going to be a public correction. She thought she had finally built enough pressure to make me fold in front of the neighborhood. What she did not understand was that people like her always confuse silence with surrender. Sometimes silence is just timing. I sent one email at 8:43 p.m., careful, brief, and exactly vulnerable enough to keep her confident. I wrote that I was considering leaving the neighborhood voluntarily if that would resolve the matter peacefully, but that I needed clarification on what tomorrow's compliance action would involve. Rebecca answered in less than 4 minutes. That alone told me how badly she wanted the last word. She said her team would arrive shortly after 6 in the morning to conduct a final property contact and facilitate orderly resolution. Team. Conduct. Facilitate. Every sentence she wrote sounded like it had been assembled out of borrowed conference room language and internet legal templates. She added that continued resistance could result in additional enforcement measures. I stared at that line for a second, then forwarded the message to Olivia and let myself smile for the first time all day. Additional enforcement measures from a homeowners association president in a cream blazer. It would have been funny if it were not so arrogant. I spent the next hour setting my house the way people imagine fear would make them set it, and the way experience taught me to do it instead. I cleared the front hallway so nothing blocked the camera sight line. I charged my phone and a backup battery. I made sure my doorbell camera was saving to the cloud and positioned a second small camera inside the foyer where it could catch the entry angle without being obvious from the porch. I printed copies of Rebecca's emails, Trent's voicemail transcription, the metadata on detained script final, and the county record showing the association's actual legal status. Not because I planned to wave paper in anybody's face at the door. Props are for amateurs. But because I like the truth within arm's reach when a lie starts speaking loudly. Around 10:15, Harold texted to say he would be awake and watching from his front window. Donna replied that her grandson had checked her camera storage and everything was backed up automatically. Marisol sent one last screenshot from the neighborhood app. Rebecca had posted a vague message asking residents to remain calm during a scheduled security response in the morning. Security response. She was not even hiding the theater now. She was advertising it. I replied to no one for a while. Instead, I sat on the edge of my couch in the blue light of the living room lamp and listened to the house settle around me. Refrigeration clicking on. Air moving through the vents. The faint creak from the upstairs landing that every house has once the temperature drops a little after midnight. I had spent enough years around real investigations to recognize the shape of bad improvisation trying to harden into a plan. Rebecca thought she was controlling the script because she had the loudest voice in the neighborhood. But the loudest voice is only useful until somebody asks it for specifics. I laid out my watch, my keys, my wallet, and the leather credential case I had kept buried under ordinary life since the day I moved in. I did not open it. Not yet. The whole point of a reveal is timing, and timing matters most. When the other side has already committed to the performance. A little after midnight, I got one more voicemail from Trent. He sounded smoother now, almost relieved, like my email had convinced him I was finally ready to be managed. He said tomorrow would go easier if I stayed calm and followed instructions from the responding personnel. Responding personnel. Another made-up bridge term, close enough to official to unsettle an ordinary resident. far enough from reality to avoid direct legal language. I saved it and set the phone face down on the table. Then I did the one thing Rebecca would never have imagined from the man she thought she had cornered. I went to bed, not because I trusted the morning, but because I understood it. She needed witnesses. She needed me groggy, uncertain, reactive. She needed a sleepy man in a t-shirt standing on a porch while two costumed strangers talked over him, and a neighborhood watched from behind half-open blinds. So I gave her the only thing that matters the night before a staged humiliation. I gave her confidence. By the time I turned off the lamp, the room had gone dark except for the thin line of amber streetlight slicing across the floorboards, and my plan was simple enough to fit inside one calm breath. Let Rebecca believe I was scared. Let Trent believe I would comply. Let the fake badges step into the morning and call themselves authority where every camera could see them. Then, when the whole neighborhood was finally watching closely enough, I was going to show them the difference between power that performs and power that does not need to. At 6:12 a.m., the pounding started exactly the way I knew it would, hard enough to wake the street, theatrical enough to pull eyes to windows, and timed just after sunrise, so the whole cul-de-sac glowed with that pale gold light that makes everything look clean even when it is rotten underneath. I was already awake, dressed, coffee poured, standing in the kitchen with the mug warming my hand when the voice came through the door. Open up. Compliance action. Not a warrant. Not a court order. Not a real agency in sight. Just the same counterfeit language, polished up and delivered like it could become law if it was spoken loudly enough on a front porch. I set the mug down on the hall table and opened the door. The cool morning air came in first, carrying the smell of damp mulch, cut grass, and somebody's bacon 2 houses over. Then the performance stepped into view. Trent Malloy stood on my porch in one of the black tactical vests from Donna's camera footage. Only now it was strapped tight across his chest like he thought nylon could give him jurisdiction. Beside him stood the broader man from the rehearsal video, shaved head, black vest, stiff shoulders, a plastic badge clipped high where everyone could see it. Kyle Mercer, I would later learn, but in that moment he was just another man borrowing the posture of power. At the bottom of the walkway stood Rebecca Holloway in a cream blazer and dark sunglasses, one hand resting on her leather folder, chin tipped up like she was presiding over a ceremony she had paid to attend. And all across the street, behind cracked blinds and half-open garage doors, Maple Ridge was watching. Trent lifted a stapled packet and cleared his throat with the exaggerated seriousness of a man who had practiced in front of a mirror. He said I was being placed under community detainment for repeated refusal to comply with safety directives and that I was expected to submit to immediate escort pending final review by neighborhood enforcement. Community detainment. Neighborhood enforcement. Every word he spoke sounded like a child stacking grown-up vocabulary into a tower and hoping nobody would tap it. I looked at the packet, then at the badge clipped to his vest, then past him to Rebecca. She gave me a slow nod, the kind meant to signal inevitability. She thought this was the moment the neighborhood would finally see me fold. Kyle stepped half a pace closer and extended his hand toward my wrist, not rough, not frantic, just full of that hollow confidence people get when they think a costume is going to protect them from the meaning of what they are doing. I did not move. I just asked, quietly enough that he had to lean in to hear me. Under what authority? That question changed the air immediately. Not because they had an answer, because they did not. Trent started talking faster, layering words over the gap like he could patch it with tone alone. Board authority, safety authority, community authority. Rebecca finally stepped in from the driveway and said, loud enough for the windows around us, Mr. Walker, you were given every opportunity to resolve this. Around here, we have rules, and around here, I am the law. It was the same line, delivered with more confidence now that she had an audience. For one long second, nobody moved. A sprinkler clicked somewhere down the block. A crow called from the power line. My doorbell camera light stayed solid blue. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the leather credential case I had left closed until that exact moment. The porch went very quiet. I opened it once, clean and flat, so Trent saw it first, then Kyle, then Rebecca from 3 steps back. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gold and blue. Real seal. Real credentials. Real authority. The look on Trent's face was not fear at first. It was confusion so complete it stripped the performance right off him. Kyle's hand dropped away from my wrist like he had just remembered it belonged to him. Rebecca took off her sunglasses slowly, and for the first time since I had moved into Maple Ridge, I saw something honest cross her face. Not outrage. Not superiority. Calculation failing in real time. I kept my voice level. You do not have the authority to detain me. You do not have the authority to impersonate law enforcement. And you do not get to stage an arrest on private property because a homeowners association president thinks her clipboard is a badge. Trent opened his mouth, closed it, then tried once more to salvage the script by saying this had all been a community security misunderstanding. I almost admired the attempt. Almost. Instead, I stepped aside just enough to let him see the printed copies on the hall table behind me. The notices, the emails, the screenshots, the metadata from detained script final, the transcribed voicemail, every paper Rebecca and her little cast had handed me while building their own collapse. Then I looked past them toward the curb where two unmarked county vehicles had just turned into the cul-de-sac, slow and silent, right on schedule, and I watched Rebecca Holloway realize that every neighbor she had gathered for my humiliation was about to witness hers. The first county vehicle stopped at the curb in front of Donna Keene's house, the second just behind Rebecca's white Sport utility vehicle, and in the silence that followed, the whole street seemed to hold its breath at once. No sirens. No dramatic rush. Just two plain doors opening, two investigators stepping out in windbreakers, and the kind of calm movement that only comes from people who do not need a costume to be taken seriously. Trent's shoulders dropped the instant he saw them. Kyle looked down at the plastic badge on his vest like he was seeing it clearly for the first time. Rebecca, on the other hand, tried to recover. That was her instinct in every situation. Not truth. Not retreat. Control. She stepped forward on her heels, folder pressed to her side, and launched into a quick, polished explanation about a private neighborhood matter that had been misunderstood by a difficult resident. One of the county investigators, a woman in a dark blue jacket with a legal pad already in her hand, let Rebecca talk for exactly 6 seconds before asking the only question that mattered. Who authorized you to detain a homeowner on private property? Rebecca blinked once behind her sunglasses, then said this was not a detainment, it was a compliance action. The investigator wrote something down without reacting. That is not an answer, she said. Behind them, more front doors were opening now. A man in running clothes stood at the end of his driveway pretending to stretch. The woman with the golden retriever had stopped halfway down the sidewalk. Even Alan, the nervous board member, had appeared near the clubhouse path with both hands shoved into his pockets, watching the whole thing like he wished he could disappear into the azaleas. I stepped out onto the porch with my printed folder and handed the first investigator a clean stack clipped in chronological order. Emails, notices, screenshots, the metadata printout from detained script final, Trent's voicemail transcription, county records showing the actual scope of association authority, Donna's video stills from the rehearsal by Rebecca's rear hatch. The investigator flipped through the first few pages, then looked at Trent's vest, then at the stapled packet still in his hand. Community detainment? She read aloud, flat and unimpressed. Trent started to say they were only there to facilitate neighborhood compliance, but the words sounded weak even before he finished them. The other investigator, a tall man with a gray buzz cut and the patient expression of somebody who has heard every excuse before breakfast, asked Kyle where he got the badge clipped to his chest. Kyle did not answer right away. He just unclipped it and held it awkwardly at his side like it had suddenly become too embarrassing to wear in daylight. Rebecca tried again, telling them that Maple Ridge had unique security concerns and that her board had broad powers to protect residents. That was when Alan finally spoke up from the edge of the crowd and said, with the voice of a man choosing truth over comfort a little too late, the board did not vote for this. The sentence landed harder than anything else that morning because it broke the illusion from inside the house she had built. Rebecca turned toward him so sharply her folder slipped against her blazer. Alan, do not do this here, she snapped, and that tone, that unmasked flash of command, did more damage to her than any document I could have handed over. Because everybody heard it. Everybody on that street heard what she sounded like when the audience stopped cooperating. The investigator in blue asked Rebecca for copies of any board resolution authorizing enforcement personnel, detainment language, or removal actions against me. Rebecca said the paperwork was being finalized. The investigator asked whether Trent or Kyle were sworn officers of any agency. Rebecca said they were security partners. Trent corrected her under his breath and said consultant. Kyle said nothing at all. It fell apart by inches after that. Not with shouting. Not with spectacle. Just with questions. Simple, direct, boring questions. The kind real authority uses because it does not need performance to do the work. Who wrote these notices? Who approved the seal? Who created the enforcement division name? Why was a rehearsal captured on camera the night before? Why had a tow been attempted from private property? Why had residents been told to expect a security response? Each answer Rebecca tried to give only made the next question worse. I watched the certainty drain out of her posture one detail at a time. First the sunglasses came off. Then the folder shifted from one hand to the other. Then her voice lost that smooth boardroom polish and picked up the thin, irritated edge of somebody realizing rules might finally apply to her too. By the time the investigators asked Trent and Kyle to step aside and provide identification, the neighborhood was no longer watching me. Every set of eyes was on Rebecca Holloway. The woman who had spent 10 days building me into a cautionary tale was now standing in her own driveway, explaining why she thought a homeowners association could create a fake enforcement arm and send costumed men to a resident's front door before sunrise. And the cruelest part for her was that nobody was confused anymore. Not Donna. Not Harold. Not Marisol. Not the woman with the dog. Not the people behind the blinds who had spent a week swallowing her fear campaign because it sounded organized. They could all see it now. The fake language. The fake confidence. The fake badge clipped to a discount vest. Rebecca had wanted a public lesson in obedience. Instead, on a bright Carolina morning with sprinklers ticking in the background and half the neighborhood standing barefoot on driveways, she got something much worse. She got fact-checked in front of her own audience. By the following week, Maple Ridge sounded different. Not louder, just more honest. The neighborhood app had gone strangely quiet for 2 days after the porch incident, as if everybody needed time to pretend they had not helped feed Rebecca's version of events. Then the documents started circulating, first in private messages, then in screenshots, then in careful little driveway conversations between people who suddenly remembered how much they hated being managed by fear. The board called an emergency meeting the next Thursday night, and this time the clubhouse did not smell like passive coffee and polite denial. It smelled like rain on hot pavement, wet umbrellas, and nerves. Every folding chair was full before the meeting even started. People stood along the back wall. People leaned in the doorway. Even the ones who had hidden behind blinds that morning showed up now, carrying all the guilt and curiosity they could fit into business casual clothes. Rebecca arrived 10 minutes late, still polished, still upright, but the shine was gone. No cream blazer this time. No triumphant posture. Just a navy suit, a pale face, and a folder held too tightly. Trent did not come. Kyle did not come. The fake enforcement branch she had tried to invent had disappeared the second real questions touched it. Alan opened the meeting with the stiff, formal tone of a man who had finally realized that neutrality is just cowardice with better posture. He announced that pending review of documentation, resident complaints, and outside inquiries, Rebecca Holloway was stepping down as board president effective immediately. There was no gasp. That was the striking part. Nobody seemed surprised. The room just exhaled all at once, a long, low release of pressure that had been building for years before I ever moved in. Rebecca tried to object, but Olivia Grant was there on the side wall, legal pad in hand, and the stack of printed records on the front table was thicker than her confidence now. Donna gave her statement. Harold gave his. Marisol submitted the deleted neighborhood posts. Alan admitted the board had never voted on any detainment language, enforcement division, or private security action against my property. Denise, the other board member who had spent weeks saying nothing, finally looked up and said, very quietly, "We let this go too far because it was easier than confronting her." That sentence did something no dramatic accusation could have done. It told the truth about the whole place. Rebecca had not built power out of intelligence. She had built it out of other people's convenience. Once that convenience cracked, everything under it looked cheap. Over the next few days, the signs of her little empire disappeared one by one. The orange restriction notice vanished from my door. The false amenity suspension was rescinded in writing. The neighborhood app moderators removed her posts. The fake seal never appeared again. Trent's consultant page went offline. The magnetic decals came off as crossover. By Monday morning, the only trace left of the whole performance was the evidence copy of Kyle's plastic badge sealed in a clear bag and the memory of Rebecca standing in her own driveway, trying to explain why she thought a homeowners association could rehearse an arrest. A month later, a revised board election brought in people who seemed almost embarrassed by the word authority. They added transparency requirements, voting documentation, and a rule that no enforcement communication could be issued without formal board approval and recorded citation to the exact covenant involved. It was not glamorous. Real justice usually is not. It looks like minutes in a binder, signatures in the right places, and fewer opportunities for the wrong person to improvise power. As for Rebecca, she sold her house before the end of the season. I saw the real estate sign go up on a humid Friday morning while I was rinsing pollen off my windshield. No dramatic farewell. No apology. Just a moving truck 3 weeks later, and a final glimpse of her white sport utility vehicle backing out of the driveway she once ruled like a stage. She never looked at my house when she left. Maybe she could not. Maybe she knew the whole street was watching in a different way now. Not with fear. With memory. Maple Ridge settled after that. Kids started riding bikes past dusk again. People used the mailbox area for actual conversation instead of surveillance. Donna brought over banana bread one Sunday and told me the street had not felt this normal in years. Harold waved from his porch each morning like routine itself had become a victory. And me, I stayed exactly what I had been before Rebecca decided privacy was a provocation. I cut my grass. I checked my mail. I parked my vehicle in my own driveway and came home whenever my work required it. The only real difference was that now my neighbors understood something they had not understood before. Authority does not become legitimate because it is loud. It does not become lawful because it arrives in a vest. And it definitely does not become truth because a woman with a folder says it in the right tone. The last time I opened that leather credential case, I closed it again just as quickly and slid it back into the drawer where ordinary life lives. Because that was the whole point. Real power does not need to sit on the porch and announce itself every morning. It waits. It watches. And when fake power finally steps too far into the light, it lets the truth do what it always does. Quietly. Patiently. Inevitably.